The grand wedding was meant to seal Lady Eleanor Beaumont's fate, uniting her with the powerful Duke of Blackwood. Instead, before London's elite, the Duke's voice boomed, "You are no wife of mine!" Her world shattered. Eleanor fled, a public humiliation etched into history. Yet months later, a desperate plea pierced the quiet of her exile. The Duke's young heir, Thomas, gravely ill, cried out for the woman his father had so cruelly rejected. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Lady Eleanor Beaumont, at 22 years of age, possessed a beauty that was both striking and understated. Her auburn hair, a rich cascade of burnished copper, framed a face adorned with intelligent, emerald-green eyes that missed little. She was the daughter of Viscount Beaumont, a man of considerable standing in society, though his fortune, while respectable, was not vast enough to secure his only child, a match of unparalleled grandeur without some strategic maneuvering. Eleanor had been raised with the expectation of an advantageous marriage, a duty she understood and accepted with a quiet grace. Unlike many young ladies of her acquaintance, however, her education had not been confined to accomplishments designed solely to attract a husband. Her governess, a woman of progressive views, had fostered Eleanor's natural curiosity, encouraging her to delve into literature, history, and even the rudiments of natural philosophy. She spoke French and Italian fluently, played the pianoforte with skill, and possessed a keen wit that, while often restrained in polite company, sparkled amongst those she trusted. Her betrothal to Adrian Blackwood, the formidable Duke of Blackwood, had been considered a triumph by her parents. At 32, the Duke was a decade her senior, a man whose reputation preceded him like a chill wind. He was undeniably handsome, with dark, piercing eyes and a commanding presence, but his demeanor was often described as cold, even arrogant. His first Duchess had died in childbirth 5 years prior, leaving him with a young son, Thomas, now 6 years old. The Duke's wealth was immense, his lineage impeccable, and his estates sprawling across several counties. To marry him was to secure Eleanor's future, elevate her family's standing, and ensure a life of comfort and influence. Yet from their first formal introduction, Eleanor had felt a distinct lack of warmth from her intended. His conversations were clipped, his gaze assessing rather than admiring, and his occasional smiles seemed more a social formality than a genuine expression of amusement. Eleanor, ever hopeful and determined to fulfill her role, had made earnest attempts to bridge the chasm between them. She inquired about his interests, spoke of her own, and tried to engage him in discussions beyond the weather or the latest London gossip. Each effort, however, met with a polite but firm wall of indifference. He seemed perpetually preoccupied, his mind elsewhere, and his responses were often monosyllabic. Her attempts to connect with young Thomas, the Duke's son, proved slightly more fruitful, though still challenging. The boy was shy, withdrawn, and still deeply grieving the loss of his mother. Eleanor, remembering her own childhood loneliness, approached him with gentle patience, reading him stories, drawing pictures, and attempting to coax a smile from his solemn face. Thomas, with his wide, serious blue eyes, would sometimes offer a small, hesitant smile in return, a flicker of warmth that gave Eleanor a fragile hope. He was a quiet child, often found clutching a worn wooden soldier, his only companion in the vast, echoing halls of Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor itself was a testament to centuries of ducal power and wealth. Its imposing Gothic architecture, with its towering turrets and intricate stone carvings, dominated the landscape. Inside, the grandeur was overwhelming. Vast reception rooms adorned with priceless tapestries, galleries lined with ancestral portraits, and libraries filled with leather-bound volumes. Yet, for all its magnificence, the manor possessed an undeniable coldness. The sheer scale of the rooms, the heavy, dark furnishings, and the hushed atmosphere created an impression of solemnity rather than comfort. Servants moved silently, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs, and the laughter of children seemed a distant, forgotten sound. Eleanor, during her brief visits before the wedding, often found herself wandering its endless corridors, feeling like a small, insignificant figure swallowed by its history. She imagined bringing warmth to its stone heart, filling it with music and laughter, but the Duke's presence, or rather his absence, seemed to permeate every cold corner. Among the many guests who frequented the Beaumont household in the weeks leading up to the wedding was Lady Constance Hartley, Eleanor's cousin. Constance was a year older than Eleanor, with striking dark hair and eyes, and a sharp, calculating mind hidden beneath a veneer of charming vivacity. She was unmarried, her own prospects somewhat diminished by a lack of significant dowry, and she harbored a deep-seated envy of Eleanor's good fortune. Constance had always been ambitious, her gaze fixed on the highest echelons of society, and the Duke of Blackwood represented the pinnacle of such aspirations. She would often offer Eleanor unsolicited advice, laced with subtle barbs about how to manage the Duke, how to dress, how to behave. Eleanor, ever trusting, initially dismissed these as harmless expressions of sisterly concern, unaware of the venom that simmered beneath Constance's polished exterior. Constance's eyes, Eleanor noticed, lingered a little too long on the Duke whenever he called, and her compliments to him were always a shade too effusive. As the wedding day drew nearer, Eleanor's initial hopes began to wane, replaced by a growing unease. The Duke remained distant, his attention seemingly consumed by estate matters or parliamentary duties. Their conversations, when they occurred, were formal and perfunctory. He never spoke of their future together, never offered a tender word or a reassuring touch. Eleanor found herself questioning the wisdom of the match, despite its undeniable advantages. Was a life of gilded loneliness truly what she desired? She yearned for companionship, for intellectual stimulation, for a connection that went beyond mere societal obligation. Her romantic hopes, nurtured by novels and whispered dreams, felt increasingly foolish in the face of the Duke's impenetrable reserve. Regency society, with its intricate dance of etiquette and expectation, provided a constant backdrop to Eleanor's internal turmoil. The season was in full swing, and every ball, every rout, every afternoon call was an opportunity for observation and judgment. Ladies in their elaborate gowns, adorned with jewels and feathers, gossiped behind their fans, their smiles often masking sharp tongues. Gentlemen, in their impeccably tailored coats and breeches, discussed politics, horses, and the latest scandals with equal fervor. Eleanor, always impeccably dressed in the latest fashions, delicate muslin gowns for daytime, shimmering silks for evening, moved through these gatherings with an air of quiet dignity. She was admired for her beauty and her family connections, but the whispers about the Duke's coldness and his son's melancholy had already begun to circulate. She heard snippets of conversation, veiled remarks about the challenges of marrying a widower, especially one so notoriously reserved. The pressure to present a perfect facade, to embody the ideal duchess, weighed heavily upon her. Her internal conflict intensified with each passing day. Duty demanded she proceed with the marriage, honor her family's wishes, and secure her future. Her heart, however, yearned for something more, something intangible that the Duke seemed utterly incapable of providing. She imagined a life where her intellect was valued, her opinions respected, and her affections returned with genuine warmth. But such dreams felt like luxuries she could ill afford. A woman of her station was expected to marry well, produce heirs, and manage a household. Love, if it came, was a bonus, not a prerequisite. She tried to convince herself that affection would grow with time, that the Duke's reserve was merely a protective shell, and that beneath it lay a man capable of tenderness. Yet the evidence of her interactions with him offered little reassurance. He treated her with a detached courtesy, as if she were a valuable acquisition rather than a future partner. The days blurred into weeks, each bringing the wedding closer. The final fittings for her gown, The selection of the wedding breakfast menu, the endless stream of congratulatory calls, all served to heighten the sense of inevitability. Eleanor found herself spending more time in the quiet solitude of her father's library, seeking solace in books or taking long, solitary walks in the family gardens, trying to reconcile her expectations with the stark reality of her impending marriage. She observed the blooming roses, their delicate petals unfurling in the morning sun, and wished her own future held such promise of beauty and warmth. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle, a sweet perfume that seemed to mock her growing apprehension. She would often pause by the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky, and wonder if she was making the right choice, if she was truly prepared for the life that awaited her. The weight of her family's expectations, the societal pressure, and her own dwindling hopes created a suffocating embrace. The night before the wedding, Eleanor lay awake in her childhood bed, the moonlight streaming through the lace curtains. Her maid, Martha, had carefully laid out her wedding gown, a vision of white satin and delicate lace, on a velvet chaise lounge. It shimmered in the dim light, a silent, beautiful sentinel of her fate. Sleep eluded her. Her mind raced, replaying every brief formal interaction with the Duke, every polite but distant glance. She thought of young Thomas, his solemn blue eyes, and wondered if she could truly be a mother to him, a source of comfort in his lonely world. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Blackwood, a title of immense prestige, but at what cost to her spirit? She closed her eyes, trying to conjure a sense of excitement, of joy, but all she felt was a profound sense of nervous anticipation, a quiet dread mixed with a desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, happiness might still find her within the golden cage of her impending marriage. The dawn, she knew, would bring with it not just a new day, but a new, irrevocably altered life. The silence of the house was broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, a mournful sound that seemed to echo her own unspoken fears. She turned onto her side, pulling the silk sheets tighter around her, wishing for the oblivion of sleep, but it remained stubbornly out of reach. The weight of the coming day pressed down upon her, heavy and inescapable. She imagined the grand church, the expectant faces, the solemn vows, and a shiver ran down her spine, not of cold, but of an inexplicable foreboding. The morning of her wedding dawned crisp and clear, a deceptive beauty that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface of London society. St. George's Church, Hanover Square, stood majestic and imposing, its grand portico adorned with garlands of white roses and lilies, their delicate fragrance mingling with the crisp autumn air. Carriages, emblazoned with family crests, lined the streets, disgorging London's elite, all eager to witness the union of Lady Eleanor Beaumont and the Duke of Blackwood. The air buzzed with anticipation, a symphony of hushed whispers, rustling silks, and the distant peal of church bells. Inside, the nave was a breathtaking spectacle of wealth and influence. The pews, polished to a high sheen, were filled with ladies in their finest silks and satins, their bonnets adorned with plumes and ribbons, and gentlemen in impeccably tailored coats, their cravats tied with studied nonchalance. Every eye was fixed on the aisle, awaiting the arrival of the bride. Eleanor, cloistered in a private antechamber with her mother and Martha, felt a tremor of nerves course through her. Her wedding gown, a masterpiece of white satin, French lace and seed pearls, shimmered around her. The high neckline and long sleeves, fashionable for the season, lent an air of demure elegance, while the voluminous skirt, supported by layers of petticoats, swept gracefully to the floor. A delicate veil of Brussels lace, secured by a tiara of diamonds, framed her face, partially obscuring her emerald eyes, which held a mixture of apprehension and a fragile hope. Her mother, Lady Beaumont, fussed with a stray curl, her own face alight with pride and a touch of maternal anxiety. "You look exquisite, my dear," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "A true duchess." Eleanor offered a weak smile, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep, steadying breath, trying to calm the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. This was it, the moment she had been prepared for her entire life. As the organist struck the opening chords of the wedding march, a hush fell over the congregation. Eleanor's father, Viscount Beaumont, a man usually composed and stern, offered her his arm, his grip surprisingly gentle. His eyes, usually so reserved, held a rare glimmer of paternal affection. "Ready, my love?" he whispered, his voice gruff with emotion. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Together, they began the slow, measured walk down the long aisle. The scent of lilies was almost overpowering. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, trying to ignore the sea of faces, the curious stares, the barely audible murmurs that followed her progress. She saw the Duke standing at the altar, his back to her, a tall, imposing figure in his formal black attire. Her heart gave a lurch. She focused on his broad shoulders, imagining the life they would build together, trying to convince herself that affection would grow, that happiness awaited. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, almost suffocating blanket. As they reached the altar, the Duke turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she saw something akin to regret, or perhaps even pain, flicker in their depths, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual impassive mask. Her father placed her hand in the Duke's, a symbolic transfer of guardianship. The Duke's hand was cold, his touch brief and impersonal. The Archbishop, a venerable man with a kindly face, began the solemn ceremony, his voice resonating through the hushed church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Eleanor listened, her mind a whirl of emotions. She heard the familiar words, the sacred vows, and prepared herself to repeat them, to pledge her life to this man, to this future. Then, just as the Archbishop paused, ready to ask the Duke if he would take Eleanor as his lawful wedded wife, a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the reverent silence. It was the Duke's voice, amplified by the acoustics of the church, carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Stop," he commanded, his tone devoid of emotion, yet ringing with an undeniable authority that silenced every whisper, every rustle. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with confusion and alarm. The Archbishop looked bewildered, his spectacles slipping slightly down his nose. The Duke turned, not to Eleanor, but to face the assembled guests, his gaze sweeping over them with an icy disdain. His voice, when he spoke again, was low but carried an unmistakable force, each word a hammer blow. "I cannot proceed with this farce, Lady Eleanor Beaumont," he declared, his eyes finally settling on her. "You are no wife of mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, echoing in the stunned silence. Eleanor felt as if the very ground beneath her feet had dissolved, her breath caught in her throat, her vision blurring. She swayed, her father's hand instinctively tightening on her arm to steady her. Then came the accusation, delivered with chilling precision. "I have discovered, to my profound disgust, that this entire arrangement is a deceitful scheme. Lady Eleanor, you, in concert with your conniving cousin, Lady Constance Hartley, have conspired to ensnare me in this marriage through a fabricated scandal. Your intentions are not honorable, but mercenary and manipulative." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his gaze unwavering, utterly condemning. "I will not be made a fool of. I will not be bound to a woman who would resort to such base tactics." With that, he turned on his heel, his dark cloak swirling around him, and strode purposefully down the aisle, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sudden, profound silence. The heavy oak doors of the church swung open, admitting a shaft of bright sunlight, and then closed behind him with a resounding thud, sealing Eleanor's fate. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had just transpired. The accusation, the public humiliation, the Duke's cruel words, they crashed over her like a tidal wave, leaving her gasping for air. Her beautiful wedding gown, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a shroud of shame. She looked around, her eyes wide and pleading, seeking an explanation, a friendly face, but all she saw were expressions of shock, pity, and thinly veiled triumph. Lady Constance Hartley, who had been seated in a prominent pew near the front, now stood, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine distress. A delicate lace handkerchief was pressed to her lips, but Eleanor, through her haze of shock, caught a fleeting glimpse of a smirk, a flicker of satisfaction that quickly vanished behind a mask of feigned horror. Constance's tears, Eleanor realized with a sickening lurch, were entirely false. The guests, initially stunned into silence, now erupted into a cacophony of whispers. The scandal, raw and unprecedented, spread like wildfire through the church. Ladies fanned themselves vigorously, their eyes darting between Eleanor and the empty space where the Duke had stood. Gentlemen exchanged shocked glances, their faces a mixture of disbelief and morbid fascination. This was not merely a broken engagement, this was a public denunciation, a complete and utter ruin. Eleanor felt every eye upon her, every whisper a dagger to her heart. The weight of their collective gaze was unbearable, crushing her spirit. Her father, Viscount Beaumont, his face a mask of fury and shame, finally broke the spell. His grip on Eleanor's arm tightened painfully. This outrage, he spluttered, his voice trembling with indignation. His carefully constructed world, his daughter's advantageous match, had crumbled into dust before the eyes of all London. The shame of it would haunt their family for generations. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and bewildered disappointment, as if she were somehow responsible for this catastrophic turn of events. He had always been a man of strict propriety, and this public disgrace was an affront he could barely comprehend. The Archbishop, recovering his composure, attempted to restore order, but it was futile. The wedding was irrevocably ruined. Eleanor, her legs feeling like lead, could no longer bear to remain in the church, under the relentless scrutiny of so many unforgiving eyes. The beautiful flowers, the soaring music, the expectant faces, all had turned into instruments of her torment. With a choked sob, she pulled her hand from her father's grasp, her veil askew, and fled. Her white satin gown, once a symbol of purity and joy, now trailed behind her like a tattered flag of defeat as she stumbled down the aisle, past the gaping guests, and out into the harsh glare of the London street. The carriage that had brought her to the church, now a symbol of her shattered dreams, waited silently. She climbed inside, her body shaking uncontrollably. The image of the Duke's cold, accusing face burned into her memory, his words echoing in her ears. "You are no wife of mine." The world, as she knew it, had ended. Chapter 3. Seeking Refuge and Whispers of Change. The journey from London to the tranquil embrace of the Cotswolds was a blur of tears and silent despair for Eleanor. The scandal had erupted with the force of a cannon blast, reverberating through every drawing room and coffee-house in the capital. Her name, once spoken with respect, was now synonymous with disgrace. Her father, consumed by shame and anger, had insisted she leave London immediately, seeking refuge from the relentless whispers and pointed stares. It was her Aunt Beatrice Ashford, her mother's elder sister, who offered a sanctuary. Aunt Beatrice, a widow of independent means and an even more independent mind, resided in a charming, albeit somewhat eccentric, country estate, nestled amidst the rolling hills and picturesque villages of Gloucestershire. Her home, the Haven, was a world away from the rigid strictures of London society, a place where intellect and unconventional thought were not merely tolerated, but celebrated. Upon her arrival, Eleanor retreated into herself, a wounded bird seeking solace in the deepest shadows. The vibrant green of the Cotswold landscape, the gentle murmur of the river, the sweet scent of honeysuckle, all seemed a cruel mockery of her internal desolation. She spent her days cloistered in her room, the curtains drawn, the memories of that dreadful day replaying endlessly in her mind. The Duke's accusing voice, the shocked faces of the guests, the searing humiliation. It was a torment she could not escape. Food held no appeal, conversation was an effort, and sleep offered little respite, haunted as it was by nightmares of public scorn. Her once bright spirit was dimmed, her intelligence dulled by the weight of her grief and shame. She felt utterly worthless, a broken vessel cast aside. Aunt Beatrice, a woman of formidable intellect and boundless compassion, approached Eleanor's recovery with a delicate balance of patience and gentle persistence. She did not press for details of the scandal, nor did she offer platitudes. Instead, she simply provided a quiet, nurturing presence. She would sit with Eleanor in companionable silence, reading aloud from poetry or philosophical texts, or simply tending to her needlework. Gradually, imperceptibly, Eleanor began to emerge from her self-imposed exile. Aunt Beatrice, with her keen understanding of the human spirit, knew that true healing required more than just time. It required purpose. She began to introduce Eleanor to her eclectic circle of friends, scholars, artists, naturalists, and social reformers who gathered regularly at the Haven for lively discussions and intellectual discourse. It was at one such gathering that Eleanor first encountered Mr. Julian Thorne. He was 28, a physician by training, but his interests extended far beyond the confines of conventional medicine. Julian was a researcher, an innovator, driven by a profound desire to alleviate suffering and improve the lives of the less fortunate. He hailed from a modest gentry family, his intellect and ambition his greatest assets, rather than inherited wealth or title. His appearance was not that of a dashing rake, but rather of a man whose quiet intensity drew one in. He had kind, intelligent blue eyes, a thoughtful brow, and a gentle, reassuring smile. His clothes, while well-made, were practical rather than ostentatious, reflecting his focus on substance over superficiality. Their first meeting was at Aunt Beatrice's salon, a room filled with the scent of old books and brewing tea, where conversations flowed freely and ideas were exchanged with passionate enthusiasm. Eleanor, still hesitant to engage, found herself drawn into a discussion about the burgeoning field of public health, a topic Julian spoke of with compelling eloquence. He listened intently when she tentatively offered a point, his gaze respectful and genuinely interested, a stark contrast to the dismissive politeness she had grown accustomed to from gentlemen of her former acquaintance. He saw her mind, not just her beauty or her tarnished reputation. Their conversation, initially formal, soon deepened, touching upon literature, social injustices, and the potential for scientific advancement to better humanity. Eleanor found herself speaking with a freedom she hadn't experienced in years, her intellect reawakening under the warmth of his genuine engagement. Slowly, under Aunt Beatrice's patient guidance and Julian's respectful companionship, Eleanor began to heal. The suffocating weight of shame began to lift, replaced by a burgeoning sense of self-worth. Julian, recognizing her innate compassion and keen mind, invited her to assist him at his small charity clinic in a nearby village. It was a humble establishment, serving the local poor who often lacked access to proper medical care. Eleanor, initially hesitant, soon found purpose in the practical application of her intelligence and empathy. She helped organize supplies, read to ailing children, and learned to dress wounds under Julian's gentle tutelage. The raw suffering she witnessed, the simple gratitude of the patients, put her own past humiliation into perspective. Here, her name and lineage meant nothing. Only her actions, her kindness, and her willingness to help mattered. Her friendship with Julian deepened with each passing week. They spent hours discussing everything from the latest medical discoveries to the poetry of Lord Byron, from the plight of the working class to the philosophical implications of scientific progress. Julian treated her as an intellectual equal, valuing her opinions and encouraging her insights. He saw beyond the scandal, beyond the societal judgment, to the intelligent, compassionate woman beneath. He never once mentioned the Duke or the wedding, allowing Eleanor to speak of it only when she was ready. When she finally did, pouring out the pain and confusion of that day, he listened with quiet understanding, offering not pity, but unwavering support. He helped her to see that the Duke's actions reflected on his character, not hers, and that her worth was not defined by the cruel pronouncements of a misguided man. Yet despite the healing and the burgeoning friendship, Eleanor still grappled with an internal struggle. Trust, once so freely given, was now a fragile thing. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving scars on her self-worth. Could she ever truly trust another man, another promise? Could she ever truly believe in her own value after being so publicly denounced? Julian's steadfast kindness was a balm, but the wounds of the past lingered, whispering doubts in the quiet hours of the night. She often found herself observing him, searching for any hint of artifice, any sign that his genuine affection might be a facade. But Julian remained consistently, authentically himself, kind, intelligent, and deeply principled. News from London, though distant, occasionally reached the haven, carried by Aunt Beatrice's more socially connected acquaintances. The Duke of Blackwood, it was said, had become even more reclusive, his already cold demeanour hardening into an impenetrable shell. The scandal had, ironically, tarnished his own reputation, albeit in a different way. Society, while condemning Eleanor, also viewed the Duke's public denunciation as an act of extreme cruelty, an ungentlemanly display that reflected poorly on his character. He was now largely isolated, his social standing diminished by his own rash actions. And then came the most shocking news. 3 months after the failed wedding, Lady Constance Hartley, Eleanor's ambitious cousin, had indeed married the Duke of Blackwood. The whispers suggested a hasty, quiet ceremony, devoid of the pomp and circumstance that had been planned for Eleanor's wedding. The irony was bitter, a testament to Constance's cunning and the Duke's apparent susceptibility to manipulation. Eleanor felt a pang of something akin to pity for the Duke, trapped by his own pride and Constance's machinations. One blustery autumn afternoon, as Eleanor was helping Julian organize medical texts in the clinic, a breathless messenger arrived at the haven. He carried an urgent, sealed letter addressed to Lady Eleanor Beaumont, bearing the distinctive crest of the Duke of Blackwood. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, a sudden, unwelcome surge of dread and curiosity. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The elegant script was unfamiliar, but the message was stark and terrifying. It was from Mrs. Gable, Thomas's former nurse, now dismissed by the new Duchess. Young Thomas Blackwood, the Duke's 6-year-old heir, was gravely ill. A virulent fever had taken hold, and he was delirious, his small body racked with pain. And in his fevered state, he was crying out, not for his father, not for his new stepmother, but for Lady Eleanor. The words were a desperate plea, a ghost from her past, reaching out across the chasm of her humiliation, pulling her back into the very world she had so desperately tried to escape. The urgent plea from Mrs. Gable shattered the fragile peace Eleanor had painstakingly built. Young Thomas, gravely ill, calling for her in his delirium. The words echoed in her mind, stirring a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Her heart ached for the child she had briefly hoped to nurture, the solemn boy who had offered her fleeting, hesitant smiles. But a bitter resentment also gnawed at her. How could she return to Blackwood Manor, to the man who had publicly shamed her, to the woman who had orchestrated her downfall? The thought of facing the Duke, of enduring Lady Constance's triumphant sneers, filled her with a profound dread. Yet the image of Thomas, small and vulnerable, suffering alone, was a powerful counterweight to her pain. Her compassion, a core tenet of her being, warred fiercely with her wounded pride and the lingering trauma of her humiliation. Julian, observing her distress, read the letter over her shoulder, his brow furrowed with concern. "He needs you, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice devoid of judgment, filled only with understanding. And if he is truly as ill as this letter suggests, he needs medical attention that may not be readily available or properly administered at Blackwood Manor, especially with a new Duchess who seems to have little regard for him. He paused, then offered, "I will accompany you, not as a companion, but as a physician. My skills might be of use, and your presence, I believe, is vital for the boy's recovery." His offer was a lifeline, a practical solution that addressed both her emotional turmoil and the urgent medical need. With Julian by her side, the daunting prospect of returning to Blackwood Manor seemed less terrifying. His quiet strength and unwavering support were a comfort she had come to rely upon. The journey back to Blackwood Manor was fraught with anxiety for Eleanor. Each mile that brought them closer to the imposing estate felt like a step back into the nightmare she had escaped. The familiar landscape, once a symbol of her lost hopes, now seemed to mock her with its grandeur. Julian, ever perceptive, sensed her apprehension and engaged her in calm, reassuring conversation, diverting her thoughts with discussions of medical advancements and the natural beauty of the passing countryside. He spoke of the resilience of the human spirit, of the power of compassion, and of the importance of facing one's fears. His presence was a steadying anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. Their arrival at Blackwood Manor was met with a mixture of shock and barely concealed hostility. The Duke's butler, a man of impeccable decorum, looked as if he had seen a ghost when Eleanor stepped from the carriage. Word of their presence quickly reached the Duke. Adrian Blackwood appeared in the grand hall, his face a mask of disbelief, his dark eyes widening almost imperceptibly at the sight of Eleanor, now transformed. The shy, hopeful girl he had rejected was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet strength and serene dignity, her auburn hair pulled back elegantly, her simple but well-made travelling gown a testament to her newfound self-possession. Julian, standing respectfully beside her, introduced himself as a physician, explaining the urgency of Thomas's condition. The Duke, still reeling from Eleanor's unexpected return, could only nod, his usual arrogance momentarily replaced by a flicker of genuine concern for his son. They were led immediately to Thomas's bedchamber. The air was thick with the scent of camphor and illness. The boy lay pale and listless in the vast four-poster bed, his small face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and ragged. He thrashed weakly, his eyes fluttering open occasionally, his lips murmuring unintelligible words. But then, as Eleanor approached, a faint, almost imperceptible sound escaped his lips. "Lady Eleanor, my angel." Her heart twisted with a profound ache. He remembered her. He needed her. Without a moment's hesitation, Eleanor knelt by his bedside, her hand gently stroking his fevered brow. Lady Constance, now the Duchess of Blackwood, swept into the room, her face a thundercloud of fury. Her dark eyes, usually so calculating, now blazed with undisguised jealousy and resentment. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" she demanded, her voice sharp and shrill. "How dare you return to this house, Lady Eleanor, after the disgrace you brought upon us?" Her words were venomous, but Eleanor, focused entirely on Thomas, barely registered them. Julian, however, stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Duchess, your stepson is gravely ill. My concern, and Lady Eleanor's, is solely for his well-being. Any other matters must wait." Constance scoffed. "He is merely suffering from a common chill." "You exaggerate, sir. He has been a troublesome child, prone to dramatics." Her callous disregard for Thomas's suffering was chillingly apparent, confirming Mrs. Gable's earlier hints of neglect. It became clear that Constance, consumed by her own ambition and resentment of Thomas as an obstacle to her own potential heirs, had paid little attention to his deteriorating health. Julian immediately set to work, his medical bag open, his movements precise and efficient. He examined Thomas thoroughly, his brow furrowed with concentration. He diagnosed a severe lung infection, a dangerous condition in an era before modern antibiotics. He prescribed a regimen of cooling compresses, herbal remedies, and careful monitoring, explaining his rationale to the Duke with quiet authority. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained by Thomas's side, her presence a soothing balm. She spoke to him in soft tones, sang lullabies, and gently wiped his brow, her touch bringing a flicker of peace to his restless sleep. Her compassionate care, combined with Julian's expertise, slowly began to turn the tide. Over the next few days, Thomas's fever gradually receded. His breathing eased, and the colour slowly returned to his pale cheeks. Julian's medical expertise had undoubtedly saved his life. The Duke, witnessing Eleanor's unwavering devotion and Julian's skillful intervention, began a slow, agonizing process of realization. He saw the stark contrast between Eleanor's selfless care and Constance's cold indifference. He remembered Eleanor's genuine attempts to connect with Thomas months ago, and the boy's shy, hopeful responses. The accusations he had hurled at her on their wedding day now seemed monstrously unjust, born of his own pride and Constance's insidious manipulations. He had been a fool, blinded by anger and a desire to protect his reputation, and in doing so, he had nearly cost his son his life and driven away the one woman who truly cared for him. The weight of his terrible mistake pressed down upon him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. One evening, as Thomas slept peacefully, his breathing even and regular, the Duke sought Eleanor in the library. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now felt charged with unspoken emotions. He stood before her, a man stripped of his usual arrogance, his dark eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion, I was wrong. Terribly, unforgivably wrong." He confessed his belief in Constance's fabricated story, his pride wounded by the perceived deception, his fear of being publicly shamed. He spoke of his regret, his isolation, and the profound emptiness he had felt since that day. He then, with a desperate sincerity, proposed reconciliation. "Please, Eleanor," he pleaded, "return to Blackwood. Be my Duchess, be Thomas's mother. I will make amends. I will devote my life to earning your forgiveness, your affection." Eleanor listened, her heart a complex tangle of emotions. The man before her was a shadow of the arrogant Duke who had publicly humiliated her. His remorse seemed genuine, his plea heartfelt, but the wounds he had inflicted ran deep. She looked at him not with anger, but with a quiet, resolute dignity. "Adrian," she said, using his given name for the first time in years, her voice steady and clear. "I appreciate your words, and I believe your regret is sincere. But the woman you rejected at the altar is not the woman standing before you now. That girl, who yearned for your affection and a life within your gilded cage, is gone. You stripped me of my illusions, but in doing so, you inadvertently set me free." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I have found my true worth, Adrian, not in a title, not in wealth, but in purpose, in compassion, and in genuine connection. I cannot return to a life built on obligation and a past betrayal. My heart, my future, lies elsewhere." As if on cue, Julian Thorne entered the library, his presence a quiet affirmation of Eleanor's words. He had come to check on Thomas, but his eyes, when they met Eleanor's, conveyed a depth of understanding and affection that needed no words. He did not speak, but his presence was a powerful statement. The Duke's gaze flickered between them, a dawning realization of the profound bond that had formed in his absence. Julian then stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm, addressing Eleanor directly. "Eleanor," he began, his hand reaching for hers, his touch warm and reassuring, "I know this is not the time or place, but my heart compels me to speak. I offer you not a title nor vast estates, but a partnership built on respect, on shared purpose, and on a love that sees and cherishes your true spirit. I offer you a life where your intellect is celebrated, your compassion is valued, and your happiness is my greatest desire. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor looked from the Duke's devastated face to Julian's kind, earnest eyes, The choice, once unimaginable, was now clear. The Duke, his face pale with shock and despair, watched as Eleanor turned fully to Julian, her hand clasping his with a quiet certainty. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace and joy. "Yes, I will." The Duke, his world crumbling around him for a second time, could only stand by, a silent, broken witness to the woman he had cast aside, choosing a path he could never offer. He had vowed she was no wife of his, and now, truly, she was not. With a heavy heart, he watched Eleanor and Julian leave the library, their hands intertwined, walking towards a future he had forfeited through his own pride and folly. The news of Lady Eleanor Beaumont's engagement to Mr. Julian Thorne sent shockwaves through London society, eclipsing even the lingering scandal of her aborted wedding to the Duke of Blackwood. It was an announcement that defied every convention, every expectation. A woman of Eleanor's lineage, once destined for a ducal coronet, choosing to marry a physician from the modest gentry, a man whose greatest assets were his intellect and his compassion, rather than his fortune or title. It was simply unheard of. The drawing rooms buzzed with incredulity, speculation, and not a little envy. Some whispered that Eleanor had lost her mind, others that she was seeking revenge on the Duke, but a growing number, particularly among the more progressive thinkers, saw it as an act of courageous independence, a woman choosing her own path rather than succumbing to societal pressure. The contrast between her previous arranged match and this love match could not have been starker. The Duke, Adrian Blackwood, represented the pinnacle of aristocratic power and wealth, a life of gilded obligation. Julian, on the other hand, offered a life of shared purpose, intellectual partnership, and genuine affection. Eleanor, once a pawn in the intricate game of social advancement, was now a woman making a conscious, heartfelt choice. She had traded a life of cold grandeur for one of warm intimacy, a title for true companionship. Her decision was a testament to her transformation, a declaration that her worth was not defined by external validation, but by her own values and desires. The Duke, reeling from Eleanor's refusal and the near loss of his son, found himself in a precarious position. The whispers about his cruelty at the altar had intensified, and his reputation, already tarnished, was now further damaged by the clear evidence of Lady Constance's neglect of Thomas. He knew he had to act, not just for his own sake, but for Thomas's future, and to salvage what little honor he had left. In a move that stunned society, the Duke issued a public statement, a rare and unprecedented act for a man of his standing. He acknowledged his grave error in judgment regarding Lady Eleanor Beaumont, admitting that he had been misled by false accusations and that her character was, in fact, beyond reproach. He publicly exonerated her, declaring her innocence in the most unequivocal terms. This public acknowledgement, while too late to win Eleanor back, went a long way in restoring her reputation and silencing the most malicious gossip. The Duke's statement also paved the way for the exposure of Lady Constance's manipulation. With Eleanor's name cleared, society's gaze turned sharply to the new Duchess. Evidence began to emerge, quietly at first, then with increasing clarity, of Constance's calculated lies and her deliberate efforts to poison the Duke's mind against Eleanor. Servants, emboldened by the Duke's public apology, came forward with accounts of Constance's cruelty towards Thomas and her vindictive nature. The Duke, now seeing his wife through a lens of painful clarity, initiated proceedings to annul his marriage to Constance, citing her deceit and her neglect of his heir. The process was swift and brutal, leaving Constance utterly disgraced and socially ruined. She, who had so cunningly sought to elevate herself, found herself cast down from the very heights she had so desperately coveted. But by then Eleanor had moved on, her focus firmly fixed on her future with Julian. Eleanor's father, Viscount Beaumont, initially struggled with his daughter's unconventional choice. The prospect of a ducal alliance had been a source of immense pride, and its loss, followed by the public humiliation, had been a bitter pill to swallow. However, witnessing Eleanor's quiet strength, her renewed happiness, and the genuine respect Julian commanded, his paternal pride slowly began to shift. He saw that his daughter was not merely settling, but thriving. He observed Julian's intelligence, his integrity, and the profound love he held for Eleanor. Eventually, with a gruff but heartfelt admission, he gave his blessing, acknowledging that Eleanor had found a happiness that no title or fortune could guarantee. He was proud of the woman she had become, a woman who dared to choose love and purpose over societal expectations. Preparations for Eleanor and Julian's wedding were a stark contrast to the lavish spectacle planned for her first. There were no grand pronouncements, no endless guest lists, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Instead, it was an intimate and meaningful affair, held in the small, picturesque village church near Aunt Beatrice's estate. Only close family and a select group of friends, those who truly understood and supported their union, were invited. Eleanor chose a simple, elegant gown of cream silk, adorned with delicate embroidery, a reflection of her refined taste and her rejection of unnecessary extravagance. The focus was not on societal approval, but on the profound commitment they were making to each other. In the months leading up to the wedding, Eleanor immersed herself in Julian's work. She became an indispensable partner in his medical charity, helping to expand its reach and improve its efficiency. Her organizational skills, honed by her upbringing, proved invaluable, and her compassionate nature made her a beloved figure among the clinic's patients. She also continued her intellectual pursuits, delving deeper into subjects that had once been mere hobbies. Encouraged by Julian and Aunt Beatrice, she began to write, penning thoughtful essays on women's education, social reform, and the importance of accessible healthcare. Her articles, published anonymously at first in progressive journals, began to gain attention for their insightful arguments and eloquent prose. She was finding her voice, not just as a woman, but as a thinker and an advocate. Amidst these preparations, a letter arrived from the Duke of Blackwood. It was a deeply personal missive, filled with genuine remorse and a quiet dignity. He reiterated his profound apology, offered his sincere blessing for her impending marriage, and most importantly, humbly requested that she remain a presence in Thomas's life. He understood that he had no right to ask, but Thomas still spoke of her, still cherished the memory of her kindness. Eleanor, her heart softened by his evident transformation and her own healing, agreed. She would visit Thomas occasionally, not as a potential stepmother, but as a beloved friend, a compassionate figure in his young life. It was an act of grace, a testament to her capacity for forgiveness, and a recognition of the innocent child's need for affection. The wedding day itself was bathed in the soft glow of a spring morning. The small church was filled with warmth and genuine affection. Eleanor walked down the aisle, not with nervous anticipation, but with a radiant smile, her eyes shining with happiness as they met Julian's. His smile, gentle and loving, reflected the depth of his devotion. The vows they exchanged were not mere formalities, but heartfelt promises of a shared future, a partnership of equals. There was no pomp, no pretense, only pure, unadulterated love. After a simple wedding breakfast at the Haven, surrounded by their dearest friends and family, Eleanor and Julian departed for their new life in Bath. It was a city renowned for its intellectual circles, its elegant architecture, and its burgeoning medical community, a perfect setting for their shared aspirations. As their carriage rolled away, Eleanor looked back at the familiar landscape, a sense of profound peace settling over her. She was no longer the humiliated bride, but a woman reborn, embarking on a chosen path, her heart full of hope, and her hand clasped firmly in the hand of the man she truly loved. The golden cage had been shattered, and in its place, a boundless horizon awaited. 18 months had passed since Eleanor and Julian Thorne embarked on their new life in Bath. And the city, with its elegant crescents and vibrant intellectual scene, had proven to be the perfect soil for their dreams to flourish. Their home, a charming Georgian townhouse overlooking the Royal Crescent, was a hub of activity, filled with the scent of Julian's medicinal herbs, Eleanor's freshly brewed tea, and the quiet hum of purposeful work. Their medical clinic, established in a more modest part of the city, was thriving, serving the poor and underserved with a dedication that earned them widespread respect. Eleanor was not merely a silent partner. She was an active, indispensable force. She managed the clinic's administration, organized patient records, and, drawing on her innate empathy, provided comfort and practical advice to the families who sought their help. Her presence, calm and reassuring, was a source of immense solace to many. Beyond her work at the clinic, Eleanor's intellectual pursuits had blossomed. Her essays on women's education, advocating for a curriculum that extended beyond mere accomplishments to include science, history, and critical thinking, had gained significant attention. Published under a discreet pseudonym, a Lady of Bath, her arguments were lauded in progressive circles, sparking lively debates in literary salons and even catching the eye of influential figures. She also wrote compelling pieces on public health and social reform, drawing on her experiences at the clinic to highlight the urgent need for better sanitation and accessible medical care for all strata of society. Her voice, once silenced by societal expectations, now resonated with clarity and conviction. Their marriage was a testament to a loving, equal partnership. Julian cherished Eleanor's intellect as much as her heart, and she, in turn, admired his unwavering principles and compassionate spirit. Their days were filled with stimulating conversations, shared laughter, and a deep, abiding respect for each other's work and passions. They were not merely husband and wife, but best friends, confidants, and collaborators in a shared vision for a better world. The quiet intimacy of their life, so different from the grand, hollow existence Eleanor had once been destined for, was a constant source of joy and contentment. The greatest joy, however, arrived with the news of Eleanor's pregnancy. The prospect of starting a family, of nurturing a child born of their love and shared values, filled them both with an overwhelming sense of happiness and anticipation. They spent hours discussing names, decorating a nursery, and dreaming of the future they would build for their little one. It was a future free from the constraints of title and expectation, a future built on love, learning, and purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, a familiar, albeit unexpected carriage pulled up to their townhouse. From it emerged young Thomas, now 8 years old, his solemn blue eyes alight with excitement, and behind him the Duke of Blackwood. The Duke, though still a formidable figure, carried himself with a newfound humility. His dark eyes, once cold and arrogant, now held a quiet thoughtfulness, a reflection of the profound changes he had undergone. Thomas, seeing Eleanor, rushed forward, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "Lady Eleanor, my angel!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with genuine affection. Eleanor embraced him warmly, her heart swelling with tenderness. Their bond, forged in a time of crisis, had endured. The Duke greeted Eleanor and Julian with respectful deference. He spoke of Thomas's continued improvement, his growing confidence, and his own efforts to be a more present and loving father. He had transformed Blackwood Manor, introducing reforms for his tenants and supporting local charities, a quiet penance for his past transgressions. He maintained a respectful distance from Eleanor, acknowledging her chosen path and the happiness she had found. He was no longer the arrogant man who had publicly shamed her, but a man humbled by his mistakes, seeking to live a life of greater integrity. News of Lady Constance, though rarely discussed, occasionally filtered through the social grapevine. Stripped of her title and her social standing, she had been forced to leave England, eventually remarrying a much older, less distinguished gentleman in a quiet ceremony abroad. Her ambition had ultimately led to her downfall, leaving her with a life far less grand and far more unhappy than the one she had so ruthlessly pursued. Eleanor felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of justice and a renewed appreciation for the genuine happiness she had found. Eleanor often reflected on her extraordinary journey, from the public humiliation at St. George's Church to the authentic happiness she now experienced. The pain of that day, once so debilitating, had become a catalyst for her growth. She realized with profound clarity that the Duke's public rejection, though cruel, had been the greatest gift. It had shattered the golden cage of expectation, forcing her to forge her own identity, to discover her true strength and purpose. It had led her to Julian, to a love that was deep and true, and to a life that resonated with her deepest values. She had not merely survived the scandal, she had bloomed in its aftermath, cultivating a life rich in meaning and genuine connection. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Julian gently placed a hand on her swelling abdomen. "Our child will know a world of choice, Eleanor," he said, his eyes full of love. "They will be taught to think, to question, to follow their own convictions, not merely the dictates of society." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And they will know the power of compassion, Julian, and the joy of a life lived with purpose. Their commitment to living purposefully, to raising their children with love, choice, and a strong moral compass, was the bedrock of their future." The final scene found Eleanor in their flourishing garden, the scent of roses and lavender filling the air. She was heavily pregnant, a picture of serene contentment. A stack of medical texts lay beside her on a stone bench, open to a page on childhood fevers, a testament to her continued intellectual engagement. Julian joined her, a gentle smile on his face, his hand resting protectively on her belly. The sun, warm and golden, cast long shadows across the lawn. She looked at him, at the life they had built together, a life of quiet dignity, profound love, and meaningful work. She had been rejected by a duke, but she had found her true kingdom, not in a grand manner, but in the embrace of a man who saw her, truly saw her, and in the purposeful life they shared. She was no duke's wife, but she was Julian's wife, a mother-to-be, a scholar, a healer, and most importantly, a woman who had chosen her own freedom. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from in the comments. Your support means everything.